The village lay nestled between rolling hills and winding rivers, a place where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the old ways of the ancestors. People there believed that every child born carried not only the blood of their family but also the blessing or curse of the spirits. They listened closely for a newborn's first cry, for the cry meant breath, strength, and connection to life itself. When a baby entered the world in silence, it unsettled even the bravest hearts, for it was said that silence at birth meant the child carried a secret too heavy for the living to bear. So when she was born, a little girl with wide, unblinking eyes and lips that parted but gave no sound, the midwives exchanged uneasy glances. They rubbed her chest, they tapped her feet, they prayed over her tiny body, but not a single cry escaped her throat. Her breath came steady, her small hands grasped the air, and her eyes, oh her eyes, locked on the faces above her as though she already knew the world she had entered. The midwives whispered among themselves, and by morning, the whole village knew that the chief's new daughter had been born without a voice. The elders shook their heads gravely. "The spirits have taken her sound," they murmured. Some women clucked their tongues with pity, while others crossed their arms, muttering that such a child could only bring trouble. A child without a cry was like a bird without wings, unnatural, incomplete. The chief, proud and stubborn, declared that she would live and be raised like any other child, but even his words could not sweep away the unease. In hushed corners, villagers whispered that her silence carried meaning, that perhaps she was cursed or perhaps chosen. As she grew, her silence never broke. Where other children laughed and shouted, she sat quietly, her head tilted, her gaze steady. She had a way of listening that unsettled people, as though she understood more than words could carry. When scolded, she did not flinch or cry, she simply stared with eyes too deep for her age. Some found her gaze comforting, while others turned away, unsettled by the sense that she could see through their thoughts. Her mother wept often, wishing to hear her daughter speak even a single word, but the girl would only press her small hand against her mother's cheek, her eyes soft with affection. She learned to communicate with gestures, with movements of her hands and the tilt of her head. Soon her family could read her easily, the way her eyes brightened when she wanted something, the way her hands fluttered when she wished to warn, the way she clasped her chest when she wanted to show love. It was not words, but it was a language all her own. Other children at first mocked her. They cupped their throats and exaggerated their own voices, laughing at her silence. They called her hollow, ghost-born, spirit-touched. Yet when they looked into her eyes, their laughter faltered. She had a way of staring at them until the giggles stuck in their throats and they turned away, suddenly unsure of themselves. It was as though she carried a mirror in her gaze, reflecting the cruelty back at those who mocked her. Soon enough, the children learned to keep their distance. Among the adults, opinion was divided. Some treated her with gentle pity, slipping her treats or small gifts, whispering that her life would always be hard. Others avoided her altogether, muttering that her silence was a bad omen. A few even feared her, believing she had been born with no voice because the spirits were keeping it for themselves, waiting for a day when she would speak not as a child, but as something else entirely. Her stepmother, for her mother had died when she was still young, did not show kindness. She saw the girl's muteness as weakness, a convenient excuse to make her bear the heaviest burdens. The silent child carried water from the well, fetched firewood, scrubbed floors, and tended animals without protest, for she had no words with which to complain. Yet there was something unyielding in her silence, a patience that made her stepmother grit her teeth. No matter how hard she was worked, no matter how cruel the treatment, the girl's steady gaze never broke. And though no one said it aloud, there were moments when strange things seemed to happen around her. When she walked by, restless animals grew calm. When she fixed her gaze on the river, its surface stilled as if listening. Once, during a storm, lightning cracked so close to the village that the people screamed, but the bolt stopped just short of striking her where she stood. She did not flinch. She only lifted her chin, her eyes reflecting the storm's fire. Some swore she had smiled that night, though no one dared say so loudly. The elders began to watch her more closely. They noted the way she never stumbled, even in darkness. They noticed how she could catch meanings in conversations she was not part of, as though words did not need to be spoken for her to hear them. They began to murmur that perhaps her silence was not a curse but a vessel, a space left empty for something greater to fill. Still, most of the village feared what they did not understand. They shook their heads and said it would have been better if she had cried once, even if only to prove she was like other children. But she never cried, never spoke. Her silence was complete, as though her voice waited, patient and hidden, for a day the world was not yet ready to face. Her days unfolded like an endless repetition of shadows and whispers, the kind of life where silence weighed more than any stone she carried. In the village, every child grew up surrounded by the rhythm of laughter, arguments, songs and prayers, yet for her the world existed in gestures and the unspoken. When she was small, her silence drew pity. Women would crouch down, pressing fingers to her lips, sighing and saying how sad it was that she had been born without a voice. Men shook their heads, muttering about how such a child would never bring honor to a household. That pity, however, did not last long. As she grew, the softness around her turned to sharpness, and the pity was replaced by scorn. Her silence was not seen as a wound anymore but as a flaw to exploit. The other children mocked her. They would ask her questions deliberately, knowing she could not answer, then laugh when she stood still with her expressive eyes wide, trying to form a response with only her hands. They made animal noises, saying she was no better than a goat that bleated soundlessly. Some mimicked her gestures cruelly, turning her attempts at communication into theater for their entertainment. She learned to lower her eyes and move past them, but each cruel moment lodged itself deep within her, another weight she bore silently. Yet if children were cruel, adults were no kinder. The elders would frown when she failed to respond quickly to commands. "A useless girl," they said, shaking their heads, "a shadow who eats but cannot contribute." Even though she worked harder than most, running errands, sweeping, cooking, her efforts were overlooked because she had no way to defend herself or demand recognition. Her silence became an open invitation for others to impose burdens on her, because she could not protest, could not cry out in refusal, could not shame them with words. Her stepmother, sharp-eyed and cold-hearted, was the one who took greatest advantage. To the rest of the village she pretended care, sighing about how unfortunate it was to raise a voiceless girl. But in the privacy of their compound, she used that muteness as a weapon against her. Whenever food was scarce, she ensured the girl ate last, if at all, knowing no complaint would escape her lips. Whenever water was needed from the distant stream, she sent the girl again and again, until her shoulders ached from carrying heavy gourds, and her feet blistered on the stones. "You have no voice," her stepmother would sneer, "so use your body instead." Every injustice settled inside the girl like coals pressed into the flesh. But she bore them with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that strength could take a shape other than words. While others thought her powerless, she learned to read faces more deeply than anyone else. She saw the flicker of deceit in a smile, the twist of greed in an eye, the tremble of fear in a hand. While they believed her empty, she became filled with awareness, every silence sharpening her perception. Her eyes became her voice. When she looked at someone with kindness, they felt soothed. When her gaze hardened, people shifted uneasily, unable to explain why her silence seemed heavier than a shouted curse. Children stopped laughing when they noticed her stare lingered too long, as if she could see what they hid. Adults stopped their conversations abruptly when she entered, nervous without knowing why. Even the animals seemed to respond. Dogs followed her quietly, and birds landed near her feet without fear. Still, she remained the stepmother's scapegoat. Each day began before dawn, when she was ordered to fetch firewood, sweep the courtyard, wash the clothes and prepare meals. The stepmother ensured that if anyone questioned her, she would describe the girl as lazy, because the girl could not contradict her. Whenever something went missing, whether a coin or a piece of cloth, the blame fell on the voiceless one. Her silence was twisted into guilt, as if not speaking meant hiding secrets. But in the stillness of the nights, when she lay awake staring at the thatched roof, she discovered her silence was not just absence, it was also space. In that space she listened to things others could not. The wind spoke to her, its changes carrying messages only her sharpened senses could decipher. The crackle of the fire told her stories, the rustling of trees hinted at movements beyond the village, and the beating of her own heart seemed to echo with something vast and hidden. She knew, though she could not explain, that her silence held more power than the village would ever guess. They mocked her, they burdened her, they twisted her muteness into a chain. Yet every cruel act carved into her a strength that was invisible but real. She bore the weight of silence not as one broken by it, but as one shaped into something else entirely, something waiting for the right moment to be revealed. When word first spread that a wealthy man had set his eyes upon her, the villagers could scarcely believe it. The voiceless girl, the one mocked and pitted, the one treated as little more than a burden, now she was to be chosen as a bride? It was as though the river itself had begun to flow backwards. Some gossiped with wide eyes, whispering about how fortune sometimes fell upon the most unlikely shoulders. Others laughed bitterly, saying it was proof that wealth made men reckless, willing to buy even silence if it pleased them. The man was powerful, known in the region for his cattle herds, his fields heavy with grain, and his influence among the elders. His word carried weight. When he spoke in the gathering place, others listened. He was not old, but his eyes carried the sharpness of someone who understood exactly how to bend people to his will. Why he chose her was a matter of speculation that spread like fire through the village. Some said he had grown weary of women who spoke too much, who argued, who tried to twist his authority. A silent wife, they reasoned, would bring him peace. Others whispered darker thoughts, that he wanted her because she could never accuse him, never challenge him, never betray him with words. Her stepmother was quick to cloak herself in false pride. She paraded through the village boasting, "Did I not raise her well? Even without a voice, she has captured the attention of a wealthy man." But in the privacy of their home, she looked at the girl with narrowed eyes, as though this twist of fate had robbed her of something. For years she had controlled the girl, using her muteness as a leash. Marriage would mean release, and that thought filled her not with relief but with bitterness. The villagers too could not decide how to feel. For some, it was a blessing. "Perhaps this is her chance to be valued," they murmured. "Maybe her silence hides something the spirits themselves favor, and that is why she is chosen." They imagined her finally wearing fine cloth, eating well, and sleeping in a house with strong walls. For others it was a curse. "There is no harmony in a marriage built on silence," the skeptics warned. "A home without words will be a house of shadows." The girl herself remained outwardly calm, though her heart beat with conflicting tides. She had long ago stopped hoping for fairness from life, and so she did not believe in sudden fortune. Yet she sensed there was something beneath this promise of marriage that unsettled even the earth beneath her feet. The man's eyes lingered too long, not with affection but with possession. The way he looked at her was not as one looks at a partner but as one examines an object he has acquired. Still the village prepared. Custom demanded celebration, and so they gathered gourds of beer, slaughtered goats, and sang songs that tasted hollow to her ears. Women spoke of blessings, men of alliances, while children giggled, imagining the silent bride in her new household. Beneath the laughter, though, unease clung to the air. It was not joy that guided their steps but a strange compulsion, as though the wedding was necessary but not natural. On the surface, the promise of marriage seemed like salvation. But in the hushed corners of her mind, and in the way the night winds stirred uneasily through the trees, it already felt like the first step into a fate both inevitable and dangerous. The days leading up to the wedding unfolded with a flurry of activity, the kind of movement that turned the village into a stage where every hut, every courtyard, became part of the performance. Women bustled about, grinding millet, pounding yams, brewing beer in great clay pots. The rhythmic sound of pestles beating against mortar echoed like a heartbeat across the compound, mixing with the shrill laughter of girls braiding each other's hair and practicing the songs they would sing on the wedding night. Men sharpened knives for the slaughtering of goats, inspected drums, and brought forth their finest garments from old chests where cloth had been carefully folded and kept away from dust. To the outside eye, it was the picture of joy, of community united in celebration. Yet beneath this layer of festivity was an unease that no one dared put into plain words. The silence of the bride was not just a condition, it had become an omen. Some whispered that a marriage to a voiceless woman would invite restless spirits, for words were the bridge between the living and the unseen, and what kind of household could exist without that bridge? Others, lowering their voices further, recalled old tales told by their grandmothers, stories of those born without a voice, who were not truly mute but kept their tongues until the appointed time, when their words would fall like curses. The elders, men whose hair had turned white and whose skin bore the maps of years spent under the sun, were especially unsettled. They gathered beneath the ancient tree at the edge of the village, speaking in riddles so their fears would not be carried by careless ears. "When silence lingers too long," one said, tapping his walking stick against the ground, "it grows heavy like a storm cloud." Another murmured, "The gods do not create without reason. If she cannot speak now, perhaps her tongue is being saved for something that will change us all." Even those who had mocked her began to fidget in her presence. The children who once ridiculed her gestures now avoided her gaze, for there was something in her eyes that unsettled them. It was not anger exactly, nor sorrow, but a quiet weight, as though she carried secrets they could not name. Women preparing her trousseau stole glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking, whispering about how her stillness seemed deeper than shyness, almost like a warning. The men who laughed about how lucky her husband would be to have a wife who could never argue often faltered when they felt her eyes on them, as if her silence made their words brittle. The rituals began days before the wedding. She was bathed in herbs said to cleanse the spirit, her skin rubbed with oils that made it glisten in the firelight. She wore strings of beads, bright and heavy, clinking softly with her every step. Drums beat through the nights as young men danced, stamping their feet into the earth until dust rose like smoke. Women sang, their voices high and clear, weaving songs of blessings. Yet each time the bride entered, her silence seemed to swallow their voices for a heartbeat, leaving an emptiness that felt unnatural. Offerings were made at the shrines. Chickens were sacrificed, their blood staining the ground as elders chanted for peace in the union. The priests muttered prayers longer than usual, their hands trembling as they scattered kola nuts into calabashes. One kola nut split in an odd way, its halves jagged instead of clean, and the priests exchanged uneasy glances. Still they pressed on, unwilling to be the ones to halt the tide of tradition. Her stepmother strutted about, pretending to beam with pride, yet inside she simmered. She thought of how this marriage would lift the girl from her control and place her in the household of a man beyond her reach. She masked her resentment with false joy, but when she looked at her stepdaughter, her teeth clenched, and she hissed insults only loud enough for the girl to hear. "Remember who gave you food when no one else wanted you?" she whispered harshly. The girl as always answered with silence, but her gaze lingered, steady as if even that venom could not pierce her calm. As the final day approached, the village shimmered with both excitement and dread. Fires were lit at every corner, their smoke curling into the night sky like prayers made visible. The songs grew louder, the dances more frenzied, but behind the joy there was a sense of something waiting. Some said it was the weight of the girl's silence pressing on them, others claimed it was only nerves before a wedding, but no one could shake the feeling that they were building toward a moment that would not end as weddings usually did. She sat quietly through it all, adorned and prepared, her silence now transformed into something sacred. Even those who once dismissed her as pitiful began to avert their eyes in respect, though they could not explain why. Her presence no longer felt small or diminished. It felt vast, like a river held behind a dam, waiting for the floodgates to open. And though they tried to ignore it, everyone, from the oldest elder to the youngest child, could feel the same truth. Silence, when it breaks, can shatter the earth itself. The night of the wedding carried with it a strange heaviness, as though the air itself had grown too thick to breathe. The feasting had ended, the drums had slowed, and the songs that once rang sharp beneath the stars now lingered in uncertain tones. People sat in clusters around dying fires, their laughter forced, their gazes shifting often toward the bridal hut. Within its walls, the girl sat waiting, her body adorned in beads and fine cloth, her eyes steady as the torches flickered and cast long shadows across the ground. It was the custom for the bride to be taken into the hut, where her husband would join her, and the union would be sealed under the cover of darkness. Women had bathed her in oils and covered her hair with a veil that shimmered faintly in the firelight, but all the adornments did not disguise her silence. The hush that clung to her unsettled even those who had prepared her, as if they were dressing a spirit instead of a bride. The groom entered with the confidence of a man who had paid his bride price in full, his garments heavy with wealth, his wrists adorned with golden bangles that clinked softly as he moved. He smiled at those who followed him with cheers, but his smile carried a shadow, one that deepened when his gaze fell upon her waiting form. He dismissed the last of the attendants with a nod, and the torchlight dimmed until only the soft glow of embers lit the hut. For a long moment, silence thickened between them. He studied her, this bride who could not speak, who had been mocked and pitted her whole life, and he allowed himself a private smirk. "At last," he muttered under his breath, though she could not reply. He reached forward to lift the veil, his hand steady, his breath heavy. But as the veil slipped from her face, something shifted. Her eyes, wide and dark, did not blink. They fixed on him with a weight that rooted him to the floor. He froze for a heartbeat, then laughed uneasily, telling himself he was only nervous. Yet even he could not deny the strange chill that ran through his spine as her silence deepened, pressing into him like a physical force. The torches sputtered, their flames dimming as though afraid. Shadows thickened on the walls, writhing like restless things. And then, after years of being voiceless, of bearing scorn and burdens in silence, she parted her lips. The sound that came was not the gentle voice of a bride, nor the timid murmur of someone unaccustomed to speech. It was a voice layered and deep, resonant as though it carried more than one tone, more than one presence. The hut seemed to vibrate with it, the air trembling, the ground shifting slightly beneath their feet. It was not merely her voice, it was a chorus, an echo that seemed to rise from beyond her, from the earth itself, from the silence she had carried all her life. The groom staggered back, his eyes wide. "What, "What are you?" he stammered, his arrogance breaking apart like clay in rain. But she continued, her voice growing stronger, filling the hut until it spilled outside, making the villagers pause mid-conversation, their heads snapping toward the sound. "You buried me in silence," she said, her voice echoing with something unnatural, "but silence does not die, it waits." Each word reverberated as though carried by unseen drums, resonating in the bones of all who heard. Outside, whispers broke among the villagers. Did she speak? Did the voiceless one speak? They rose to their feet, straining to hear, their unease turning into terror as the unnatural tone reached their ears. Inside, the bride stood, her gaze burning. Years of scorn and injustice were etched into her, but her voice now carried the weight of prophecy. "This house," she intoned, "shall not know peace. This night, the silence you mocked will return as doom." The walls of the hut creaked as though pressed upon by unseen hands. The embers in the fire flared, burning blue for a moment before dimming again. The groom, trembling, tried to command her, but his words were swallowed by the air, lost against the force of her voice. When she fell silent again, the pause was heavier than the words themselves. The villagers outside stood frozen, their hearts thundering as though they too had been inside the hut. The girl who had never spoken had finally broken her silence, and the sound was not salvation, it was judgment. The hush after her first words was unbearable, as though the very air in the hut had turned solid. Outside, villagers huddled closer to the walls, straining to hear what could not possibly be real, whispering to each other with fear-stricken eyes. Inside, the groom's body trembled, his pride stripped away. He had expected silence forever, the docility of a bride without a voice, but what he received was a torrent that no man could contain. Her mouth opened again, and the voice that emerged was heavier than before, layered like thunder rolling through deep valleys. It was not the voice of a single woman but of many, as though generations spoke through her throat, each tone sharpened with truth long buried. Her eyes glowed faintly in the torchlight, unblinking, and her words rolled forth like the decree of unseen judges. "You call yourself husband," she said, her voice reverberating in the walls, "but your hands are stained with deceit. You have traded favors for loyalty, taken what is not yours and hidden sins behind your wealth. On this night your bed shall not know comfort. The riches you boast will become ashes in your mouth." The groom stumbled backward, his face drained of color. His lips opened to deny her accusations but no sound came. The weight of her gaze pressed him still, and the more he struggled to speak, the more his throat seemed bound by invisible cords. He was not merely shamed, he was unmasked. Then her gaze shifted as if it pierced the hut's walls and stretched across the village. "And you," she declared, her voice now spilling outside, reaching every ear, "you who mocked me, you who laughed at my silence, you who turned pity into cruelty. Your words have been gathered and they stand against you. Your children will inherit your cruelty if you do not repent, and your laughter will sour into screams when the night returns to claim you." The villagers froze. Mothers clutched their children closer, men stared at the ground, women bit their lips. They remembered every word they had thrown like stones at her, and now each one seemed to echo back, heavy and poisonous. Her stepmother, who had lingered near the hut to savor her triumph, heard her name called next. "You who called yourself mother," the bride said, her voice cutting like a blade, "you who fed me last, who clothed me in rags, who cast burdens on my shoulders and spat venom when no one else could hear, your tongue will rot in your mouth. For every insult you hurled, you will taste the bitterness of your own cruelty. Your nights will be filled with screams that no one else will hear, for you will be alone in the darkness you created." The stepmother gasped, clutching at her throat as though the words themselves had already begun their work. She tried to curse the girl back, but her voice faltered, coming out as a cracked whisper, too weak to rise above the prophetic thunder. Those who saw her stumbled back in fear, for it seemed the prophecy had begun to unfold even before the night was over. The girl's gaze did not waver. Her silence, once mocked, had sharpened into something that cut deeper than any blade. "And to this village," she proclaimed, her words booming like drums across the compound, "you who buried truth in shadows, who hid sins beneath laughter, who turned your faces from justice, know this, the earth remembers. The wind carries what you thought forgotten. The rains will fall red, your crops will wither, your homes will tremble, until you learn that silence is not weakness but warning. The doom you laughed at will now live among you." Children began to wail, their parents covering their ears as though they could shield them from the sound. Elders sank to their knees, some praying, others shaking their heads in resignation. A storm seemed to stir above, clouds shifting unnaturally though the sky had been clear moments before. The torches flickered wildly, their flames bending toward the hut as if drawn by her voice. And yet, though her words were filled with doom, her face bore not rage but a terrible calm. She did not scream, she did not tremble, she spoke as one carrying out a duty given by forces larger than herself. Each word was steady, precise, final. By the time she closed her mouth, silence returned, not the fragile silence of her childhood, but a silence so profound that even the insects hushed. The villagers stood paralyzed, knowing the world had changed in that moment. She had been born without a voice, but when it finally came, it carried not love, not blessing, but the prophecy of ruin. The groom had always been a man wrapped in pride, his shoulders squared with the confidence of wealth, his words sharp enough to bend others to his will. But in that moment, standing inside the hut where shadows writhed and her voice echoed like thunder, all of that crumbled. His arrogance fell away as though it had been nothing more than dust clinging to his garments. He stared at her, his bride, the girl he thought he had bought into silence, and his body trembled as though the earth itself shifted beneath his feet. Her words struck him harder than any spear. She had named his sins, sins he had hidden even from those closest to him. Greed, betrayal, and worse, the blood he had shed in secret thinking no one would ever know. He remembered the man who had vanished months ago after refusing to sell his land. He remembered the wealth he had seized by cheating others, the hungry mouths left empty because of his schemes. Each memory rose before him like ghosts, summoned by the sound of her unnatural voice. Sweat poured down his face, trickling into his beard as his knees weakened. He reached for words to deny it, but his throat tightened, his tongue thick and useless. The harder he tried to speak, the more his chest constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing the breath from him. His eyes darted to the door, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, bound by her gaze. The proud man who once boasted before the elders now shook like a cornered child. His hands twitched, clawing at the air, searching for some defense, but there was none. He had believed her silence would make her weak, but now he realized that silence had been waiting, gathering, sharpening until this moment when it came back as doom. Every secret he thought buried was now uncovered, spoken aloud for all to hear. Outside, the villagers murmured, some gasping as they realized the truths hidden in her prophecy. His reputation, his power, his carefully built image, all of it shattered in an instant, crumbling beneath the weight of her words. And he, the man who had walked into the hut with the pride of a conqueror, now trembled in terror, his arrogance broken, his spirit stripped bare. The words from the bridal hut spilled into the night like venom in the bloodstream of the village. At first it was whispers, children darting from door to door wide-eyed shouting, "She speaks! She speaks!" But it wasn't joy in their voices, it was dread. Soon, families gathered outside the hut, torches flickering in their trembling hands, their eyes straining toward the shadows where the bride's voice rolled like thunder from a storm not yet seen. No one dared to interrupt her. Even the boldest hunters who had faced lions and storms kept their distance, their feet rooted in the dust. The elders pressed their ears to the wind, hearing not just her words but the weight behind them, the naming of sins, the curses woven into prophecy, the truths no one wished to confront. Some clutched their charms and whispered hurried prayers. Others pressed their children close, as though her voice could slip into their bones and hollow them out. The air itself seemed to thicken. A strange heaviness pressed down on the village as if the ground refused to breathe. The firelight dimmed unnaturally, smoke curling low, and the stars above seemed to vanish behind a sudden veil of clouds. The wind shifted without warning, rising cold against sweating skin, carrying her words far beyond the hut so that even those at the farthest edge of the village heard her doom-telling. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, twisting with each flicker of torchlight. Some swore the shadows moved on their own, bending toward the hut like listeners eager for her voice. Women covered their faces with shawls, afraid to meet the dark, while men gripped spears that suddenly felt useless, heavy, and dull. Every family stood outside, some in disbelief, some in denial, and some already trembling because they knew the sins she named were theirs. One man's face paled when she spoke of theft. A woman buried her head in her hands when she spoke of betrayal. The guilt of the village was no longer secret. It floated in the night air, thick and undeniable, and the people could not escape it. Children, sensing the fear of their elders, began to cry. Their wails mixed with the unnatural tone of her voice until the night became a chorus of grief and terror. No one dared silence her, for even the thought of entering that hut seemed like walking into the jaws of a spirit too great to resist. The village was no longer the same. What had begun as a wedding night now felt like the birth of a curse. The girl who had been mocked for her silence had become the voice no one could bear, yet no one could ignore. And as the winds grew sharper and the shadows longer, the people realized with a chill that her words were not merely spoken, they were already beginning to shape their fate. The morning after her dreadful speech, the village awoke to a silence far heavier than the one she had carried all her life. It was not the silence of peace but the hush before ruin. Men stepped into their fields expecting the usual green to greet them, but what they saw froze them where they stood. The millet that had stood tall and proud only the day before now hung limp, stalks bent as if bowing to a power greater than the sun. The beans lay shriveled in their pots, dry before their season. Women fell to their knees, clutching the brittle plants in disbelief, their cries rising into the dawn like smoke. Not far from the fields, animals began to stir strangely. Goats bleated without pause, their eyes wide and rolling as if they saw things beyond human sight. Cows kicked against their enclosures, stamping until the earth cracked beneath their hooves. Chickens refused to scratch at the ground, their wings drooping, heads twitching as though they heard whispers that humans could not. Even the dogs, loyal and fearless, tucked their tails between their legs and whined, refusing to approach the hut where the girl had spoken the night before. At the riverbank, the water no longer reflected the morning sun. It had darkened overnight, its surface sluggish, carrying with it a smell of rust and sorrow. When women came with gourds to fetch water, they dropped them quickly, retreating with faces twisted in horror. What had once been the lifeblood of the village now ran like blood itself, staining the edges of the shore red. The children who once played along the river's edge stayed far away, clutching their mother's legs, sensing the change even without words. Whispers began to spread. Her voice has power. The villagers argued among themselves, some saying it was a curse, others insisting it was not punishment but revelation. The girl had spoken not to doom them but to reveal what they had already done to themselves. Her words had been heavy with truth, and the earth, the animals, the rivers had merely answered. Old women shook their heads, muttering that the world itself had been listening to her silence all along, waiting for the moment when she would finally speak. They reminded the others of old stories, of spirits that dwell in rivers, of ancestors who watched from the soil, of justice that could be delayed but never denied. Now, they said, her voice had become the mouthpiece of all those buried truths, truths that the living had chosen to ignore. Some tried to deny it, claiming the withering crops and dark river were coincidence, that such things could happen in any season. But even as they spoke, the winds began to rise, swirling through the village with a howl that carried her voice still, as though the air itself repeated her words. Every corner of the land echoed with what she had declared, and those who had laughed at her muteness now trembled at the sound of her unseen presence. The villagers could no longer escape the realization. This was not merely a curse flung out of anger. It was a prophecy, a truth that had waited in her silent chest since her birth, a truth that the earth itself acknowledged now that it had been spoken. The sins she had named were not shadows of imagination but seeds that had been sown long ago. And now, like any seed, they had sprouted into a harvest of ruin. Her silence had been heavy, yes, but her voice was heavier still. In it lived the judgment of all things hidden, and as the village watched the land itself bend and break under its weight, they understood that she had not doomed them. They had doomed themselves. One by one, the names she had spoken the night of her wedding began to feel the weight of her words. At first, some villagers laughed nervously, claiming her voice had been nothing but a trick of the night, the feverish dream of too much palm wine and too little sense. But their laughter cracked quickly when the fates she had declared began to unfold exactly as she had foretold. The groom, once a man of arrogance and power, was the first to crumble. She had spoken of his greed, of wealth taken from others through deceit. By the next morning his storerooms, once overflowing with grain and yams, were found empty. Rats had infested them overnight, tearing through sacks, gnawing at roots, leaving nothing but husks and droppings. His riches had vanished as swiftly as if swallowed by the earth itself. The proud man who had once stood tall before all, now staggered in despair, his robes dirted, his eyes hollow. Her stepmother, who had whispered lies against her since childhood, felt her voice turn against her. She had silenced the girl for years, mocking her muteness and exploiting her labor. Now, the woman found her own throat closing, her voice stolen by the very silence she had once scorned. When she tried to speak, only dry gasps escaped, her tongue heavy as stone. Villagers watched in horrid awe as she clawed at her neck, desperate to form words, but none came. She, who had once wielded words like weapons, now lived trapped in a silence more dreadful than the girl's ever was. Another man, a wealthy elder, had been named for betrayal. He had taken land from his neighbors, twisting boundaries in the night, and built his wealth upon dishonor. Within days his body grew weak, his legs trembling beneath him. He stumbled and fell whenever he tried to walk his stolen fields. It was as though the earth itself rejected him, refusing to carry his weight. In time he stopped leaving his hut altogether, staring at the walls as though haunted by invisible eyes. The village healer, once trusted but corrupted by greed, had mixed potions that harmed more than healed. She too had been called by name. Soon after, her own herbs turned bitter, her gourds of medicine spoiled, her hands trembling uncontrollably whenever she tried to grind roots. Patients refused to come to her, afraid of what she had become. Her hut, once filled with chants and the smell of healing smoke, lay abandoned, her tools rotting with disuse. Some punishments were stranger still. A young woman who had whispered jealous lies about the bride to turn others against her, woke to find her own reflection missing from the water. Whenever she bent over a bowl or stream, there was nothing, only empty ripples staring back at her. She became frantic, crying that she no longer knew if she was alive or dead, and soon she wandered into the forest, never to be seen again. Each fate mirrored the crime, each doom fitting like a shadow to its sin. The villagers who had once joined easily in her condemnation, now watched in fear as justice unfolded. No one dared speak against her anymore. Her silence had been their comfort, her voice had become their undoing. And as the guilty fell, the innocent whispered prayers into the night, wondering what further truths her voice still held, and whether the village itself could survive the weight of her prophecy. Her story did not end with the ruins of her village. Long after the guilty had fallen and the earth had swallowed the weight of their sins, the tale of the silent bride began to travel from mouth to mouth, from fire to fire, carried on the winds of fear and awe. Traders crossing through the region spoke of a wedding that turned into a night of judgment. Hunters who had once passed through her village now avoided it, whispering to others of the cursed silence that had birthed a voice too heavy for the living to bear. The girl who had grown up without words, mocked and pitted by those around her, became more than human in the retellings. Some called her the daughter of the spirits, a child born with silence so that when she finally spoke, her voice would belong to more than just herself. It would carry the weight of the ancestors, the earth, and the unseen. Others insisted she had been a test from the gods, sent to reveal the rot hidden in the hearts of men. Her muteness had been mistaken for weakness, but in truth, it had been the silence of judgment waiting for its appointed time. Parents began to tell her story to their children as a warning. They said, "Be careful how you treat those who cannot answer back, for their silence may one day return with a voice that unmakes you." Young girls who once feared being voiceless now carried a strange pride when they heard of her, believing that silence too could be a form of strength. Young men, eager and arrogant, grew wary, reminded that power and wealth could be stripped away by the truth spoken at the right moment. Songs arose, sung in low tones during festivals or in the stillness of the night. Drummers beat slow, heavy rhythms said to echo the weight of her words, while singers chanted verses about a bride who opened her mouth only once but shattered an entire village with what she revealed. In these songs she was not remembered as cursed but as chosen, her silence transformed into legend. Travelers who heard the tale carried it further still. Soon even distant villages spoke of the bride of silence, the girl who became the voice of justice. Some feared her, whispering that her spirit still roamed, listening for lies and betrayals, ready to return at any wedding where the truth was hidden. Others honored her, leaving offerings at riversides and crossroads, calling on her strength to protect the voiceless and punish the wicked. Generations passed, but the memory of that night did not fade. Her story was woven into the fabric of warnings, of proverbs, of quiet prayers muttered by those who had been wronged but could not yet speak. And always at its heart was the image of a girl with wide, solemn eyes who had lived her life in silence, only to open her mouth once, and in that moment forever change the world around her.